I was raised in a little West Virginian town. I won't reveal the name of the institution I went to, but it was a tiny university located in a small town 15 minutes from my home. In 2021, when I was a freshman, CO continued to play a significant role in my collegiate career. The dormitories experienced one of the most significant effects. Due to CO, the majority of students rented apartments close to college instead of remaining on campus. I didn't have such a privilege because I was impoverished. Because I lived so close, I spent the weekend on campus and drove home. I still desired the complete college experience in the residence halls, though I met my flatmate on my first day. I found it a little odd that the school had given her my phone information so we could get to know one. So we had a brief text conversation. She seemed kind when she messaged me first. She was still pleasant when we met in person, but she kept quiet. She exuded a sense of affluence. She once remarked, "Due to a shortage of students, everyone has their own rooms." I did both before and after you joined last semester. I simply changed the subject and carried on the conversation because I was a little surprised and unsure of what to say. I informed her that I lived close by and that I would depart on Friday for the weekend and return at 6 o'clock on Monday. During the weekdays, she was quiet. She stayed in her boyfriend's dorm room most of the time. The spooky thing comes next. I left on the first Friday after packing my weekend belongings. As promised, I returned Monday morning at 6 o'clock. I went back to sleep because I didn't have class until 10 o'clock. After resting for roughly 10 minutes on my thick memory foam mattress, I noticed an indentation on the side of the bed. I remained motionless. I was so exhausted that I waited for a minute, hardly comprehending what was occurring. The mattress then rose again. It dawned on me then, on my bed, someone had leaned. She was facing the wall, perhaps sleeping. When I turned around, I returned to sleep as a result. I went out again the following weekend and came back at the same time. I desired more sleep once more. I felt the mattress indent once again shortly after I had fallen asleep. It wasn't just the edge this time, though. There was a person seated beside me, and the entire side sagged. I remained motionless. I lay still. After that, I heard them rise. I had a really high bed. To get on it, I actually required a step stool. I also heard them take off. After holding my breath, I turned to look. Once more, she lay with her back to the wall on her bed. I was at a loss for what to think. Was my lack of sleep causing me to have hallucinations? Was it paralysis from sleep? It isn't possible. I was still mobile. Was it possible for someone to enter my room? Not possible. The only people with keys were us. I concluded that I must be very exhausted and having hallucinations. I returned to sleep as a result. I was somewhat anxious when Monday finally arrived. She was lying down facing my bed when I stepped in. I got into bed and tried to fall asleep because she was already asleep. After 5 minutes, I sensed my bed's indent once more. I felt someone sit next to me, pressed my eyes shut, and prepared to turn around. A hand then touched the nape of my neck. My heart fell. I was afraid I was going to faint. I didn't make any movement. They did not squeeze. All they did was hold my neck. After what seemed like hours, I eventually felt them leave my bed. I remained motionless, terrified. I remained motionless for a few more seconds before turning around. I didn't care that she was sleeping with her back to the wall. I called my mother as soon as I left the room. I skipped the class. After I told my mother everything, she informed the school. Thank God, I was able to change rooms. When they asked whether I wanted to call the police, I declined. There was no concrete evidence that she had taken any action. I just requested that they refrain from assigning her a new flatmate. A few things came back to me when I unpacked them. She had previously informed me of a short-lived flatmate, but she never provided an explanation. I also recall that she once unlocked a drawer that held roughly 10 prescription medication bottles. It was for a skin condition, she explained. I questioned whether that was accurate. Perhaps she had a different illness or was experiencing unsettling drug side effects. I discovered a few days later that I had left a book and a binder in her room. Despite my lack of interest in the book, she messaged me to invite me to pick it up. I consented to get my belongings to allay suspicions, but I told her I had to concentrate on my studies in my new room. I entered as my key was still functional. I was relieved that she wasn't there. After gathering my things, Primera turned Kogo. She was there in the doorway as I turned around. She hadn't unlocked it, as far as I knew. I tried to remain composed while I grinned. At first, she remained silent. I walked away from her. "Where's your new room?" she inquired. I informed her that the first floor was where it was. I lied when she asked which hall. She inquired as to whether it was close to the entrance, the office, the stairs, etc. She persisted after I replied that I couldn't recall, saying it was. This incident happened when I was a university student, from 2021 until 2023. I was a student at the University of Huddersfield. Many students wind up staying up late on campus because it's not exactly known for its nightlife, particularly in the academic buildings that are open around the clock, like the library. Although I've never been the kind to stay out late, I was forced to do it throughout the previous year. Our professor in the advanced statistics course I was enrolled in was well known for giving us a ton of homework. I hadn't made as much progress as I should have, and the deadline for one of the largest projects was drawing near. I made the decision to utilize the computers in the company building because my laptop was giving me problems. The commercial building and the rest of the campus are somewhat separated. It is somewhat old, 3 floors high, and has always had an odd and deceptive quiet, especially at night. However, after 9 o'clock p.m., the second floor computer lab was typically rather deserted, so I reasoned that it would be the ideal location for concentration. I arrived there at about 10 o'clock that evening. It was already very quiet on campus, and as soon as I entered, I could feel how much colder it was than outdoors. The door unlocked once I heard the beep and swiped my student ID. The entire area smelled strongly of cleaning agents, so I knew I wouldn't run into any of the employees because they had already completed their rounds of the building. I immediately proceeded to the computer lab, turned on a computer, and got to work. In the beginning, it wasn't too horrible. The sound of my keyboard tapping and the computer's hum filled the quiet. I kept telling myself that I would depart before 1 o'clock a.m. by looking at the clock in the corner of the screen. However, something odd occurred at 11:30. I heard a door banging somewhere down the corridor while I was looking over some data, not at the front door. It originated further within the structure. I initially dismissed it. Perhaps it was just the caretaker or the air system. However, I later recalled that the janitors had already arrived and would have left by now. I made an effort to ignore it and continued working. However, then there were footsteps. Heavy, slow footfall could be heard coming from the corridor outside the lab. They weren't faint, nor were they hurried. They were moving as if they wanted to be heard, whoever it was. I hoped they were simply passing by because I froze in my chair and stared at the computer screen. Rather, the steps came to a stop just beyond the lab entrance. If I leaned back, I could see through the small window in the door, but I was unable to force myself to look. I simply held my breath while sitting there. I heard the door handle rattling after 10 or so seconds. It wasn't as though it had been tested carelessly. Someone was attempting to frighten me on purpose, like the person who wanted to open it, but was unable to do so. My heart began to race. After a predetermined amount of time, the lab doors automatically locked. The way they kept rattling the handle made me feel ill, even though I knew they shouldn't be allowed to enter. This continued for around 30 seconds before the sound stopped. Once more, the footsteps began to move slowly down the hallway before fading away. I debated whether or not to simply pack up and go while I sat there in solitude. However, I had an assignment due the following morning, and I had a sneaking suspicion that it might have been a simple case of a student playing around. After trying to persuade myself of that, I resumed typing, but I heard it again, not even 10 minutes later. Steps. They weren't approaching from the hallway this time, though. I was under them. There are those thin panels on the ceiling of that structure, and when the heat starts, you can occasionally hear the pipes. It wasn't pipes, though. This was the clear sound of a person dragging or crawling right over the tiles. I was afraid of what I might see when I looked up. One of the tiles moved just enough for me to realize that weight was bearing down on it. Then, like someone gently lowering themselves in an attempt to go unheard, this trickling brook appeared. This was plenty for me. I hurled my notebook into my backpack, pulled out my flash drive, and ran to the door. It seemed as though I had entered a new universe the moment I entered the hallway. Only Only the sound of my trainer squeaking on the tiles could be heard in the dimly illuminated hallway by those buzzing fluorescent lights. I tried not to sprint, but I walked quickly. When I reached the stairwell, I pushed the door open and descended. I made the error of glancing up at that point. There was a man on the landing one floor above me. He was neither a teacher nor a pupil. His clothes appeared ripped and oversized, making him appear out of place. His face was somewhat obscured, but I could see that his jaw was hanging open as if he were snarling. He remained still. He simply stood there and gazed down at me. I bounded. I nearly tripped as I sped down the stairs. I hurried towards the front entrance, after slamming through the first floor door. I barely had time to register my ID card before it clicked, but once it did, I pushed it open and sprinted across campus without turning around. I didn't stop until I was in my dorm, trying to regain my breath with my back against the door. With my door latched behind me, I only returned the following morning to turn in the projects. It seemed like a totally different place when I entered the business building during the day. However, I saw something that made my stomach turn. I saw there was a missing ceiling tile. The tile from the corner that I noticed shifting, as well as the one just above from where I had been working. It seemed like someone had been observing my work and then purposefully tampered with me by rattling the doorknob. They then climbed back up into the ceiling and entered after discovering that the door was locked. I am afraid to imagine what he would have done if he had gotten into the lab before I did. I believe it is reasonable to say that I purchase a new laptop so that I may eventually do my assignments from the convenience of my own room. Annabelle is my name. I'm a 20-year-old British citizen in high school, which is what we call college in the UK. This also happened to me. I was 16 at the time. I'm going to share with you the most terrifying day of my life. I know that seems dramatic, but you'll understand why. To put things in perspective, my school had these ID card-adorned lanyards. At the Eternity, even though anyone can enter the building, you can only enter the school by scanning one of these IDs on a screen to open the door. Although your name and face are on the IDs, many children turn them over, so their photo is hidden. In addition, this is required to open almost all of the school's doors outside of the classrooms. This was a very new school as well. Despite its diminutive size, it appeared larger due to the size of the structure. A special school for children with learning difficulties occupied 1/3 of the structure. The real high school occupied the final third of it, with the remaining third serving as a nursery. When I first arrived at this high school, I still clearly recall that everyone was instructed to make sure they didn't let anyone they didn't know inside. It was the second week of classes when this incident occurred, although I had only attended for 2 full days since I had been feeling ill all week. This occurred approximately halfway through the day, roughly 20 minutes after lunch, and I had been in geography class the entire time. We are not permitted to have drinks outside of class, so I recall consuming a ton of juice from the cafeteria during lunch since I had to finish it all by the conclusion of the meal and had nowhere to store it without it pouring over. After 20 minutes, I realized that I really needed to use the loo. We don't normally get to use the lavatory in class, so my teacher was a little miffed when I asked if I might go immediately. However, he saw that I truly needed to use the lavatory, so he reluctantly granted my request. This is important, as there wouldn't be anyone else wandering about the school at this time. During class hours, I never really noticed teachers moving about much. I exited the classroom and entered the cafeteria through a pair of double doors. Additionally, remember that nobody was inside at this time. I continued on my way to a second set of classes in a large room, went to the lavatory, and then re-entered the cafeteria to return to my classroom. However, there was a man seated at one of the tables when I re-entered the restaurant. The presence of someone inside wasn't strange. Although they don't typically stroll around during class hours, people do, as I mentioned. I mean, at the time, I was 2. I had no idea who the person seated there was. I assumed it was either a parent or a teacher because he was too old to be a pupil, and I just kept walking. However, he then said, "Hey, since I'm a bit jittery, anxious person anyhow, and I wasn't expecting him to talk to me," I squealed. Despite my embarrassment, he laughed and said, "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you." At this point, I became aware that he was wearing a lanyard. I therefore assumed that he was a teacher at this time. But as I think back on this, I see that even though he had his lanyard with the ID on, the ID portion was turned over. exposing the side with your name and face to the back of the card holder that is fastened to the lanyard. Children would constantly do that at school, as I mentioned before. It wasn't a huge concern because the scanner would still function, but it was strange for a teacher to do. However, I wasn't particularly aware of this fact at the time. I need assistance removing some work-related items from my car. He asked me, "Would you mind coming out with me for a little while?" I immediately said, "Yeah, of course." Because, once more, I simply thought this was a teacher. Silently, we left the cafe and entered the lobby before leaving the building. Additionally, I noted that he was a little uneasy, as professors frequently strike up a conversation with you while you're out and about, and he remained silent. He was also making a lot of hand motions. For example, he would occasionally put his hands in his pockets before taking them out and holding them together. I struggle in social settings and am incredibly bad. Thus, I also didn't try to strike up a conversation. The arrangement of the school-est front yard after we left the building shows that the parking lot is about 50 meters, or 55 yards, away. However, it is hidden by several bushes that make it difficult to see until you are directly next to it. You will be off school property if you continue walking without making a turn into the parking lot, he abruptly said. Yeah, my work stuff is in the boot. As we were silently making our way to the parking lot. In the UK, we refer to that as an automobile's trunk, he continued. I have a few bags, so I just need you to help me carry a coupling to the school. Yeah, that's fine, I replied. My car is the blue one down at the end, he stated as we arrived at the parking lot. Additionally, I thought I saw something in the back seat as we approached it by a few meters. I also became aware that at least 2 males were hiding in the back seat as we approached it. The rear door opened, so I suppose they realized I could see them when I froze and chose to blank out rather than flee. Suddenly, a man who I assumed to be a teacher scurried out of the car and grabbed my arm as I turned to sprint back to the school. By the way, this guy was rather big and tall. To put things in perspective, I'm 5 feet 2 and significantly underweight, so I'm not sure how I did it, whether it was a surge of adrenaline or something else entirely. I mustered all my might to tear my arm free of his hold and went sprinting back towards the school. Since my school had large glass automated doors that you had to wait for to open, I was able to hear several heavy footsteps rushing after me, but thank God, they stopped soon after I started to flee, and if they had continued, they would have undoubtedly caught up to me. However, I suppose it would have been dangerous if someone had been passing by because there were glass doors. In any case, I entered the foyer and hurried into the open cafe that was connected to the library. I then hurried up to the cafe employee and informed her of the problem. She calmed me down, escorted me to a teacher's office within the school, and made calls to the police and my parents. Since the parking lot has security cameras, they were apprehended and accused of attempting to kidnap. At the Tunaji, it was discovered that the man was able to enter the facility by flipping the ID over since a child had dropped their lanyard outside the school. I'm still receiving treatment for this situation, and I missed a few weeks of school. But I figured writing this whole thing down and sharing my story would help me process things. This continues to be the most terrifying event of my life.